The first thing I'm gonna say is wow. What a ride! Final Fantasy XVI delivered one heck of a game, and the story was fire. Literally. However, with that said, I also do recognize that the game has its issues. So once again, I will analyze yet another Final Fantasy game based on its flaws. To do this, I will break the game down into 3 categories. These being story and pacing, characters and growth, as well as gameplay and combat. And of course there will be spoilers. Just to prove everyone that I'm not a hater, which you most likely will think I am once I start analyzing, I will first mention 5 things that the game does really well and that really makes this game the masterpiece it is. Starting out with the most obvious point, the story. I mean, what can I say? The story is awesome. The journey you take with Clive is one of, if not the best story in all of Final Fantasy. The combination of simplicity in the storytelling that is comparable to the pre-PS1 era and the modern character development as well as voice acting brings the immersion to a whole other level. The cherry on top is that the game, through its M rating, also makes it even harder to predict what will happen next, making you sit on the edge of your seat through most of the game. The second positive I would like to bring up is the bosses, especially the main story bosses. The boss variation in this game is quite crazy, and most of them are really fun, especially the first time around. There are a few damage sponges here and there that slows the game down, but most of the time it's action-packed battles from start to finish with a stagger system that doesn't ruin the pacing. The third positive is the slow decay into the world of ruin. Many Final Fantasy games have used the world of ruin as the end of the world in one way or another. The difference here is the time perspective. In the previous games, the world of ruin is something that happens very quickly, after some type of calamity. However, what makes Final Fantasy XVI's take on it so different is the slow decay that happens around the world. At the beginning of the game, you hear of the spreading blight, and think of it as something you're not to worry about too much, since you have more important tasks at hand, such as freeing slaves and beating icons to a pulp. As time goes by though, it becomes clear that the blight is a top concern in the story. The constant fear of tomorrow grows bigger by the day, as the sky turns darker and the people lose their hope. A great take on a common Final Fantasy trope. As the fourth positive, the game houses the, in my opinion, best Cid to date. He is bold yet wise, powerful yet calm, and he somehow also manages to keep a sassy personality through the game without coming off as a dork. This Cid takes the best part of the other Cids and fuses them into one. Take Cid in Final Fantasy VII, for example, who is a hot-head relatable mechanic, and Cid, the Thunder God in Final Fantasy Tactics, who is a master on the battlefield. These two are some of the most iconic Cids in Final Fantasy, and yet this version manages to host most of their strengths, while keeping only a few of their weaknesses. The last positive I would like to mention is the pure epicness and scale of the story and the battles. Not since Skyrim have I really felt a power fantasy hit as hard and epically as Final Fantasy XVI did. The duels, the large-scale battles, and even the Callio fights with fitting music was more than enough to give me goosebumps on several occasions. And there we have it, 5 things that makes this game an awesome experience. And if I missed anything, please mention it in the comment section. Before I start dissecting the rest of the game like a frog in high school, please feel free to like the video and subscribe for similar content. Anyway, without further ado, let's discuss the massive flaws of Final Fantasy XVI. Starting off with story and pacing. As I said in the beginning, the story of this game is where it shines the most. With that said, there are several points where the story is let down by its pacing and its structure, as well as its indecisiveness to what type of story they want to tell. To understand these issues, we first have to talk about the structure of the story itself. What sets the story apart from previous games is that instead of the plot taking place within a few years period, we follow Clive for almost 20 years. This means that the pacing will be different than if the story took place within a smaller period, as the story needs to get filled with a lot more content, as well as a few time skips to save time. Each time skip left a hole in the story that took some time to shut, and even if the game did a good job most of the time, it does affect the pacing whether we want it or not. This also means that some of the game's main quests feel more like filler quests, as they are used to tell the story of what happened to the world while you as a player weren't present. This is necessary to understand the story properly, but unfortunately it also feels tedious, as the world-building quests are separated from the main plot. When it comes to the storytelling itself, the game is very solid. The main quest is engaging and you care for the characters. The main issue instead lies what type of story the game wants to tell. As the first M-rated mainline Final Fantasy game, one would think that the game would go all-out Game of Thrones, where mature content would be the selling point, especially after playing the demo prior to the full release. The demo consisted of the game's prologue, in which the game's main character Clive is only 15 years old and has just sworn an oath to protect his younger brother Joshua, the dominant Phoenix. This prologue ends in one of the most violent scenes I have ever seen in a game, pushing the game far into the M-rated territory, when Clive, out of control, supposedly beats his brother to death while he is begging for his life. However, after this sequence, the M-rated scenes become fewer and further in between, and it mostly feels like any other Final Fantasy story outside of a few selected moments. So was it really necessary to keep the game the way they did, if they didn't plan to stick with it? As a fan of the story looking back, I can definitely see both sides of the argument here. I do agree that this might have been unnecessary, as it isolated fans of the series before the game even started. On the other hand, the demo hooked me like no other, and it might even be the best demo I have ever played. So good or bad? I'll leave that up to you. A far bigger problem for me was that the plot kind of reached its climax far prior to the endgame, around where you fight Bahamut, as the story had problems catching up after this. Most of Waloed feels kind of pointless, as it adds very little to the story, which is kind of sad as the build-up of Barnabas Tarmer as a character starts off very well with him beating you 2 times, just to get defeated far too soon after this by the power of Brotherhood, which all feels kind of cheesy. This leads me to the next point, which is the in-game politics. The politics is actually handled pretty well compared to the world building, as it's mostly handled outside of the story. Clive's personal relations to involved parties means much more than their political role, and it is really fitting in an RPG. And I did enjoy reading up on it with the NPC Vivian every now and then. However, I do really dislike the times when this becomes a must to understand the story, more than actual lore. If I play a game, I want to get all the info necessary from the game itself, not by reading up on the side. Another story issue is the big bad of the game, namely Ultima, and the way he is set up by the story. In the beginning, he is this great, mysterious, dark character working from behind the scenes. The issue I have with this is that it's never really clear who acts on behalf of who in the grand scheme of things. Similar to the Genova and Sephiroth issue. Did Clive's mother's son Oliver ever really exist? Or was that Ultima all along? Was Ultima the darkness inside of Clive in this early stages of the game? How much did the absorbed part of Ultima affect Joshua's mind? Speaking of that, Joshua absorbing Ultima felt very badly handled. The main argument for this seems to be that Joshua had to do it to save his brother, but it becomes very confusing when Ultima starts showing up everywhere else as well. It kind of reduces the meaning of Joshua's sacrifice. The Hive Man is okay, but at least let there be some type of leverage or some meaning behind it past the moment of absorption. Now it all feels pointless when reaching the endgame, and it definitely could have been handled better. Also, why didn't Joshua reach out to Clive after the Ultima incident? One would think that the reason was that Joshua had some hidden information, but when they finally unite, so wasn't the case. Also, if Ultima was searching for Clive, why not tell me about it directly there and then? These are all small moments that can definitely be quite confusing for sure, and some extra clarity would have been appreciated. Anyway, moving on into the next category, being characters and growth. When analyzing characters and growth in FF16, it's important to once again mention the way of storytelling, since it stretches for several years. This means that each character have had a lot more time to develop, which makes it more realistic and easier to work with. The characters themselves are solid, and the main character gets a lot of screen time. The main issue here is instead that a lot of characters feels kind of left behind. There are loads of characters that the game tries to make you care for, that are simply not fleshed out enough for the player to give a crap about. Good example of this are almost every one of the side quest givers, as well as the big chunks of the hideout. I mean, they are okay, but you never really see them outside of the comfort zone, which just makes them all feel like hub NPCs instead of actual characters. On top of that, these people are supposed to be your family, and yet they all constantly send you or Gav to handle their dirty work, no matter how trivial it is. But more on that later. And we also talk specifically about Jill. She's a sweet girl and all, but most of the early game she kind of lacks personality. This becomes even more apparent when you have strong characters like Cid, Dion, Benedicta and Kopka around. The choice to wait almost all the game before fleshing her out more was kind of an odd choice, and an earlier introduction to her darker backstory could have helped the character bloom earlier. Unfortunately, when she finally gets her development, it is so far into the game already that we barely get the chance to see her from this light. Lastly, I cannot leave this topic without mentioning Ultima. I understand that he wanted a bad guy that was existentially motivated, very creepy and evil, but due to the vague writing, he unintentionally just became this super evil guy. Pair this together with a total lack of charm, and the fact that it's impossible for a normal person to relate to him, and we have a pretty dull villain kind of similar to Exdeath from Final Fantasy V. Okay, the last point, and maybe the most important one, gameplay and combat. Before we start, I would like to mention that I am not a purist when it comes to turn-based combat. By that, I mean that I have no issue whatsoever with Square trying new styles of combat. Quite opposite, I personally think the combat in this game is a lot of fun and had a great time taking down every enemy in the main story. Of course, elements and statuses could have been added and could have brought more to the game, but the main issue for me lies in the repetitiveness of these enemies when doing the side content. Speaking of the side content for this game, there is one word that summarizes most of it, and that word is boring! Honestly, there is no excuse for how much of a slog the side content is in this game. Outside of the hunting board and a select few quests, there is almost nothing that makes me ever want to repeat these quests again. Questing for the sake of questing is never a good starting point, and unfortunately, this is the feeling I have through most of the side quests. Fetch me this, kill that, and over and over and over again. If that wasn't enough by itself, the rewards are even more of a deal breaker. Crafting materials? Again? Like, why not have unlockable cosmetic or skins, so that you at least get something of value from doing these crappy quests? No, instead they decided to release the customization with the first DLC, which just feels like a big waste of potential. What is even more sad is that when you have played the game for a while and start to understand the structure of the side quests, you as a player also start to lose hope in actually getting rewarded for your quests. You stop being excited, and you just accept that questing sucks. I mean, imagine playing a game, such as Skyrim, that is known for its side quests. How many side quests would you actually care about if you knew that you wouldn't get rewarded with an armor set, a cool spell, or a weapon? The thing is, we players tend to be pragmatic, and we like to feel that the reward matched the time spent. When it comes to side quests in general, the story isn't as important as the reward, and that is just how it is. Trying to make side content solely based on story and world building will not satisfy most players. That is like going to work knowing that you won't get paid. And even if it's not the same as real life money, most players put a symbolic value on things that they have earned inside of a game. There are of course a few exceptions and quests that actually feel okay completing, but those few quests doesn't make up for the crapfest of quests that you have to go through in order not to miss anything. And that leads me to the next issue. Due to how the game handles time and time skips, there is no way of knowing what quests that will disappear. This indirectly forces you to complete them straight away unless you have played the game before, making the tedious quests even more annoying than what they have to be. Oh, and I just want to sneak this one in here once again. Not being able to sprint everywhere, such as in the hub town, or that it takes several seconds for Clive to actually start sprinting once you run, is just an awful choice of game design. Like, why do we have to build up the sprint each time instead of holding a button? At least if you plan on forcing me to fetch stuff, please don't limit my movement ability. Another complaint that I have about the gameplay is about the world itself when exploring. The thing is, just like with the crappy rewards for questing, equally crappy rewards are given to players who intend to explore. You find loads of materials and chests, but rarely anything you need outside of potions. A great example here is the legendary weapon Masamune that you find while exploring. When you find it, you most likely already have a better weapon, making the whole thing feel kind of pointless, especially since all weapons handle the same and only differ from one another in the attack stats. Speaking of the customization, it is also very limited compared to previous titles. Your setup is limited to the equipment you have chosen, as well as the icon's abilities. This is not the biggest issue since the icon's playstyle vary a lot from one another, but swapping the equipment for minor improvements feels mostly pointless. The bigger issue is when taking party into account. In this game you cannot adjust your party, and honestly, it rarely feels like they're even there, since they cannot die either way. Instead of having a party that actually supports you, you get 2 damage sponges that at best gives you some breathing room from time to time, putting this game behind both Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy XV in handling a party. Sadly, this also affects how you feel about the characters as well. Now they are just NPCs that in each cutscene act as if we accomplished something together, while in-game they were more like hired extras. They were there to take part but not intervene in the fight. What I mean is not that the game needed more playable characters, just more strategic control over the party, so that it at least feels like they have your back. And there we have it! As you can see, I had quite a lot of things that bother me, especially in the gameplay section. However, the main story and characters were so good that I still put Final Fantasy XVI very high up on the Final Fantasy hierarchy, and I refuse to call this game anything less than great. But what do you think? Do you agree, or do you think my points are all whack? Did I maybe miss something that should have been mentioned? Please comment and tell me what you think, and subscribe for more content like this. I hope to see you next time. Hej då!